what I try to do in my Indian law classes is kind of get a sense of the knowledge base and how my students talk and think about Indians. And so I always find that this cartoon's a good way to begin. It says, to begin, I'd like to show you this as in the butte, and you see sort of the chief there and the headdress and the feathers and the buckskins and all the Indians with their long hair. And then the punchline is New York 1626, Chief of the Manhattan Indians addresses his tribe for the last time. So, how many people get that joke? Okay, what makes that joke? What's the joke? What's going on there? Yeah.
Well, I think it has to do with the Manhattan Indians sold their land for a string of beads.
So the joke is based on your understanding and knowledge of an Indian treaty, the treaty for the sale of Manhattan to the Dutch. How many people know about that treaty? So how many people sort of understood this joke? Does anybody know how much the Dutch paid in beads and strings for the sale of Manhattan? $26. Does any of this sound familiar to people? Vaguely familiar? So how many people knew something about the Treaty of Manhattan by which the Dutch got this island for next to nothing? Raise your hands. Don't be ashamed. Okay, now, when I give this slide to my class, most of them are not native and they're not members of tribes. And so I then ask them, name one other treaty. And for most of my students, this is the only treaty they know. A joke in a Far Side cartoon. And I say, imagine, in fact, that some of you may go on to be judges and maybe even Supreme Court justices. And the only treaty you know anything about is this idea that the Indians sold Manhattan for next to nothing. And it plays on this stereotype that many non-Indians have, that Indians didn't appreciate the concept of private property when they sold their lands in treaties to white people. How many people have heard of that idea, that Indians thought differently about property than white folks? You know, that they're out there in nature and, you know, they're kind of communal and they're communists with a small c. So raise your hand if you thought about that you've heard of that stereotype of Indians thinking differently. Okay. And it's interesting when you go to the treaties and test that stereotype. This is a treaty some people actually have heard of, and that's the Treaty for the Black Hills. And the Sioux, of course, at a point in 1868, signed a pretty good treaty. They got a good chunk of the 4 states as part of the Greater Sioux Nation. And this was right after the Civil War. And Congress and the Army really didn't have the resources. And the men needed to fight the Sioux. And so they got a pretty good deal. And part of that Treaty of 1868 allowed the U.S. to send the Army out there to survey for a railroad. And of course, the Army Engineering Unit that's sent out there is led by General George Custer, hero of the Civil War. And Custer's men go prospecting for gold, and they find gold in the Black Hills. So all of a sudden, this treaty, which gives the Sioux all this land, they don't appreciate the gold in the Black Hills, right? Because white people have this stereotype that they don't value what's in the Black Hills. You can't let a bunch of savages have all the gold in the Black Hills. And so the U.S. government sends out a second treaty commission to negotiate a new treaty with the Sioux, and essentially to get the Black Hills from them. And it's interesting, you know, how Indians think about property differently, because if you read all of the chiefs at that treaty, at this particular treaty council in 1875, it's interesting. Little Bear, one of the great war chiefs, says, look, if a man owns anything, of course he wants to make something out of it to get rich on. And so understand here that the government's approached the Sioux about selling the Black Hills. How many of you seen that really bad movie with Val Kilmer and Sam Shepard, Braveheart or something like that? Yeah, Thunderheart. What's the motto there? The Black Hills are not for... How many people have heard that before? The Black Hills are not for sale, right? That's all those AIM guys out there. The Black Hills are not for sale. But it's interesting if you look at it. You gentlemen were sent from our great father's house. You were looking for something good, of course. We are the same. And we are glad to speak to you. You'll be persons like myself, Indians, on the earth as long as they live. I want you to feed them and give them rations every year and annuities for the Black Hills. So in fact, the Sioux were negotiating because these were all the war chiefs, and they knew that the victory over Custer had only been temporary and that the Longcoats with their Gatling guns and cannons couldn't be resisted. And so try and cut the best deal possible. Don't give away your only valuable asset, particularly when you're a dumb savage, and don't think the same way about property as white people because you're at such a disadvantage in the treaty process, which is why Spotted Bear, who's featured in one of the Caitlin photographs, another old-time war chief, says, and it's funny as you read this treaty negotiation because it's absolutely clear that the Indians are getting frustrated with how stupid the white people are, that the white folks just don't understand. And so they start getting into gestures to try and explain it. Our great father has big safe, so have we. East Hill is our safe. Get it, white guy? So as long as we live, I want our great father to furnish us with blankets and things that we live upon. We want $70 million for the Black Hills. But no, the Black Hills aren't for sale. And Indians think about property differently. Look, annuities. I mean, this is 401k planning for savages, right? In 1875, blanket Indians. That is the way you white people do. We want the same thing as you. And then Spotted Tail, another very famous Sintigleska chief, as long as we live on this earth, we'll expect pay. Now you know where the Sioux get this attitude from, okay? Now you know. They have this sense of entitlement, right? Listen, we want to leave the amount with the president's interest forever. Estate planning. By doing that, I think it would be so I can live. I want to live on the interest of my money. Let me repeat myself, stupid. The amount must be so large as to support us. We want some clothes as long as Indians live. If even only 2 remain, as long as they live, they will want to be fed, just as they are now. As long as they live, they want tobacco and knives. Until the land falls to pieces, we want these things. But Indians think about property differently than white people. That's the stereotype we've all been taught. And as I said, most of my students don't know much about any other treaty than the Treaty of Manhattan. They don't realize that there were a multiplicity of treaty traditions throughout North America, and you would find pipestone traded from the plains down into the Mississippi. And you'd see wampum work its way across the middle of the country in these great trading networks and diplomatic networks. And all these networks were facilitated by traditions of Indian treaty making. For example, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Belt, which represents the 5 nations of the Iroquois, linked together in a silver covenant chain under the White Tree of Peace at Onondaga with the Western Door, the Seneca, and the Eastern Door, the Mohawk, and the Cayuga, and the Oneida, all brought together under Hiawatha's command to form a great confederacy, a Tree of Peace at Onondaga and the Longhouse, and invite all nations to come in. And so anytime the Iroquois would trade with any other nation, they would adopt them in to their covenant chain. But most Americans don't learn that treaty story. You don't speak that language of Indian diplomacy. You speak a language of racism, which assumes that Indians are basically savages and backwards and don't understand economic development and can't govern themselves. And so you know Indians smoke 'em peace pipe, but you don't understand, many non-Indians don't understand that that peace pipe tradition comes from sacred stories of many tribes, like White Buffalo Calf Woman, who was out on the plains and she was very beautiful, and these 2 young Sioux boys see her and she says, don't even think about it, okay? Because I come from the Creator with the message of peace to you. And every time somebody dies, I want you to smoke out of this bowl and remember that life is sacred. And so just like the tobacco, which is rich and fecund in life, and you smell it and it's full, it can go up and smoke just like life. And so you better make peace with those Akiras. But most Americans aren't taught this language about Indians either. And most don't even know, for example, that in 1794, the Iroquois offered to bring in the United States 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 states into Confederacy with the Great League of Peace at the Longhouse and Onondaga. And when General Pickering was offered that belt, he threw it down and would not take it because he wanted a relationship of subservience where the Iroquois would admit that they were younger children of the Great Father and would listen and obey. And the Iroquois said, no, we want to be treated as brothers. But we don't know that language of Indian rights. And very few people are taught about perhaps the greatest example of what I call multicultural constitutionalism, this ability of indigenous peoples to use their sacred stories and their traditions and their teachings and weave them into multicultural treaty relationships, like the Penn Treaty Belt, which was given between the Delaware Indians and the colony of Pennsylvania. You can see William Penn with his Quaker hat linking arms together on a bed of white wampum, which symbolizes peace, and then these two rows of purple wampum, which symbolize blood and relationship. And they both link arms together so strong that if the lightning should cut off one arm, then I'll grab you by the other. Because that's what it means to have a treaty between Indian people. And so when the Indians have to go and remind Penn's sons, who are a bunch of land-grabbing crooks, about the father their treaty made through their oral traditions and these mnemonic devices, they understand what that treaty belt stands for. And again, they lay it down in front of Penn's sons and say, will you pick up this treaty belt? Because when the Indians gave their lands to William Penn, they told him he and they should live on those lands like brethren, not father and son, in love and friendship together, whereby they become all people and one nation, this notion of multicultural constitutionalism. Joined together so strongly that nothing should ever disunite them, but they should continue one people forever. And it was further agreed, because you should know this, your father told you, and I'm showing you this belt, by which this agreement was sanctified. It was further agreed between your father and the Indians that each should bear a share in the other's misfortunes. Because when you enter into a treaty relationship with Indians, you enter into a relationship of peace and trust and connection. That's why Indians always, you know what Penn's name was from the Delaware? Contus, feather, quill, William Penn. And every governor of Pennsylvania henceforth would bear the ceremonial clan name of Quill, of William Penn, to remind them of that promise that was originally made. And so that promise said that this country, though it might be filled with people of different nations, yet care should be taken that justice should be done to every person and no mischief happen without satisfaction being given when necessary. But most Americans don't speak this language of Indian rights. Most Americans speak this language of racism, organized around this idea that Indians are uncivilized, backward, savage people. This idea of a language of racism was developed in the 1960s. How many people know who, don't say, who knows who this guy is? Okay, old folks, look around. Okay, get depressed. How many people do not know who that is? You don't want to admit it now. That's Malcolm X. Okay. I tell my students that the autobiography of Malcolm X was rated by Time magazine as one of the 10 most important books of the 20th century, and it's really underestimated. It's much more important than that. It's an amazing book. I recommend it to all my Native students, particularly for kids who grow up on the res, who come from dysfunctional families with alcoholism and drugs and no father around. And read about Detroit Red, and read about the time he spent in prison, and read about the spiritual transformation when he discovered a religion that didn't recognize any colors, Islam, and converted to Islam in prison and went immediately to Mecca on a sacred pilgrimage and saw Muslims of all colors, from Serbia, from India, from all over the world. And he recognized that vision of universal brotherhood, which he had never seen in the white man's racist world. And he was called by Time magazine the most dangerous man in America. And a young black writer named Alex Haley, fresh out of the Coast Guard, who approached Malcolm X with a commission from Playboy magazine to write an article on the most dangerous man in America. And Haley talks about how for the next 2 hours, Malcolm just called him an Uncle Tom up and down the street. And agreed to this autobiography, this extraordinary figure, which turned out to be the last year of his life, because at the end of the book, he's assassinated. And so Haley, trying to digest all of this and writing this autobiography, writes this amazing epilogue where he talks what it was like to be around Malcolm X. In fact, what it was like for Alex Haley, the Uncle Tom, to be around Malcolm X was that after he got done spending a year with this guy, you know where he went? Back to Africa to discover his roots. He's the guy that wrote Roots. That's how much Malcolm messed with his mind. He had to go all the way to Africa to get his butt straightened out. And he says the amazing thing about Malcolm was he never lost his racial perspective. That's how Malcolm saw everything. It was all about race in America. Anything you don't understand, you just go back to that racial perspective. And waiting for my baggage, we witnessed a touching family reunion as part of which several cherubic little children romped and played, exclaiming in another language. By tomorrow night, they'll know how to say their first English word. How many people need me to fill that in? How many people know what's in between N and R? See, you all know a language of racism. Malcolm was right. Every American learns a language of racism, and everything associated with the N-word, you all know. How many people know who can and who can't use the N-word? Raise your hand if you know. How many people have a pretty good sense of when not to use the N-word? You all know a grammar of a language of racism. You know a syntax. You know a vocabulary. You know an imaginary of a language of racism organized around the N-word and all the racial subordination and Jim Crow laws and everything else that implies. You know that language. And that's what Malcolm's trying to say, that every child who comes to America learns this language that night. It is pervasive. Think about all the languages of racism you know. That's the great thing about being in a multicultural nation like this country. We all know our different languages of racism. Think about the Mexican in the American racial imagination. How many are old enough to remember driving around and seeing those out on the front with the lawn jockey? If you go on eBay, do you know how much those lawn jockeys in A1 shape bring? They are worth a lot of money. The Cisco Kid. Dun, dun, dun. Hey, Cisco, you know that? Okay. How many people remember the Cisco Kid? Hey, isn't this interesting? That we used to speak that language of racism all the time about Mexican Americans. We used to use the N-word. How many people grew up in a house in which your grandparents or parents used the N-word? Okay. How many people grow up in a house now where nobody ever uses the N-word? Gee, these languages change, where you can use them, how you can use them. Isn't that amazing? These languages change. Although, do they change that much? How many have seen the Ask a Mexican column in OC Weekly? So this guy's hanging out. He's Berkeley educated. He's the one Mexican guy in the newsroom, and all his white friends and colleagues say, "Well, you're a Mexican. Tell me, how come you guys like your food so hot all the time? You're a Mexican. What does gringo really mean?" And so he said, "I'm going to write a column called Ask a Mexican." I'm sure there's a lot of white people out there who don't know the language of being a Mexican American. So you can use this language for parody. And of course, some of these themes get recycled. They're no longer called wetbacks. What are they called? People with special driver's licenses. Illegals, undocumenteds. The language is always shifting, but we all know the code words. And depending on whether you call them undocumented or illegals, you're speaking a very specifically inflected form of that language, liberal or conservative. Isn't it amazing how complicated these languages of racism are? And so where did you take your language of Mexican American Racism 101? Did you take that language? Do you have a grammar book of Mexican American racist imagery? Do you know where did you learn it at? Just stuff you pick up along the way? You mean it's just out there in the culture? Ugh. Isn't that amazing? Okay. Sing along with me. How many remember? I am the frito bandito. Remember when you're sitting at lunch and you were always a little kid and some bully would pick up your Fritos, say, I am the friend. Then you'd punch them and the nuns would come and rap you across the knuckles. You remember, right? Didn't that happen to you? You hated that kid. He's CEO of Microsoft now. Who knows? There's lots of languages of racism in America. How many people are familiar with Korematsu? That was the case in which the Supreme Court said it was okay to lock up Japanese Americans during World War II. Think about it. So we're all sleeping in bed one morning. We turn on the radio, we listen to the news, and America's been attacked by an alien enemy. Out of nowhere, planes are flying from the sky, dive bombing and killing 3,000 innocent American citizens in a horrible grave. And my God, these aliens that look just like the people that bombed us are all over the place in the US. We better lock them up and detain them. But it's not 2001, this is 1941. And so President Roosevelt, having packed the court with most of his own appointees, convinces Congress to have the military go investigate the security situation on the western front of our homeland, because our homeland security is threatened by this alien Japanese menace. And so the general that's sent to investigate is General DeWitt. And anybody who's seen Dr. Strangelove and remember the general about our precious bodily fluids, it's based on, there's a very famous character, and most people who've seen the movie believe that Strangelove based his character on DeWitt. And he testifies before Congress, saying, I've done my report and we have to lock them up. And some of the Congress people on the East Coast are a little bit skeptical because his recommendation is we only have to lock them up on the West Coast because that's where they're all at. And so Congress is asking the general, like, how do you know these people are a threat? I mean, have you heard any reports? Have you got any spies out there? Do you have any real hard intelligence that we can rely on? And the general said, that's just it. If you understand the inscrutable character of the Japanese, the fact that we haven't heard anything is what really scares the hell out of us. It's in the congressional record. I'm not making it up. I swear to God, that's what he said. And look at the language of racism that he used to justify his conclusion. Justice Murphy, in the dissent to Korematsu, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that of course we can lock up aliens and even citizens if they're members of an alien race, if they're suspicious in time of war. And so three dissenters, Justice Murphy says, why did we lock these people up? And here's how we did it. This was how many Japanese detention camps? They were all over the West. Mass ethnic cleansing. All these areas. Oyster of all Japs in California near. Hooray. Because all these white growers were ready to move into their fields and their farms and take over their businesses. That this forced exclusion was the result in good measure of an erroneous assumption of racial guilt, rather than bona fide military necessity, as evidenced by the commanding general's final report. In it, he refers to the Japanese as subversive, as belonging to an enemy race whose racial strains are undiluted, and as constituting over 112,000 potential enemies at large today. Sound familiar? Individuals of Japanese ancestry are condemned because they're said to be a large, unassimilated, tightly knit racial group. Well, that's because California zoned them that way. They weren't allowed to live in integrated neighborhoods. They were specifically zoned in tightly isolated racial communities. They are bound to an enemy nation by strong ties of race, culture, custom, and religion. Okay, you come over here and they zone you out of existence. They put you in racially segregated neighborhoods. They confiscate your businesses. I mean, are you going to automatically start going to the Catholic Church in downtown San Francisco? Of course not. They're given to emperor worshiping ceremonies and to dual citizenship. And they actually, because California won't educate them, maintain their own schools. So we know they're bad. The title of my latest book, in fact, is taken from Justice Jackson's famous dissent in Korematsu. Jackson, very interesting. This is the guy that had been Roosevelt's attorney general in New York, and basically a country lawyer, and of all things, I mean, it was unprecedented. Nobody would ever do this. Roosevelt took his poker-playing attorney general buddy with him from the state he was governor and put him in a really important position in D.C., Attorney General of the U.S. Can you believe that? What idiot would do that? I've never heard anything. That's why Republicans hate this guy, the type of stuff he did. But it turned out that Jackson had integrity. In fact, Jackson is regarded as probably the greatest prose stylist on the court of the 20th century. And was only one of the only two justices that Roosevelt had appointed who dissented against his best buddy. And in fact, anybody know what Jackson did after he got done? He was Attorney General New York, poker buddies with the president, Attorney General US, Supreme Court guy who was on the right side of Karamazov, not a bad resume. What did he do after that? Anybody know? He was only the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. What a resume. Damn. Imagine that life, that commitment. This was a guy who understood racism at its core. And what he did in his dissent was try and warn America about the dangers of what's happening in a case of Karamazov. Because what we've done is take this language of racism and essentially create a constitutional principle out of it. And when we do that, it's really dangerous because we're a court. And because it's a precedent, it lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any judge that wants to claim an urgent need. So guess when the next time we see Karamazov cited before the Supreme Court? In the US government's Guantanamo Bay cases, of course. Karamazov has never been repudiated by the court. It stands for the proposition that in wartime, the executive needs extraordinary powers that may well be beyond the parameters of the Constitution. And so the danger of taking this language of racism and constitutionalizing is that it embeds every repetition, every new case embeds that principle more deeply in our law and expands it to new purposes. A military commander, he says a bit later, may overstep the bounds of constitutionality. Okay, so we lock up some Japanese people, during war, but, the war is over and it was, it's over with. But if we review and approve, then that passing incident becomes the doctrine of the Constitution. And there it functions like a loaded weapon. It has the power essentially to destroy our liberties at any time. And so what we find in cases like Dred Scott and in Plessy v. Ferguson and in other cases throughout our history, what we find is that the Supreme Court takes these racial stereotypes that we all have in our head and creates legal principles out of them. And so then I ask my students to think about what they know about Indians. Think about their first childhood memories about Indians. In fact, what the psychological literature shows is that most of us absorb these types of racial stereotypes about Indians, blacks, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, women, gay people at a very young age. The social science literature, a lot of it comes out of Stanford, documents that in fact kids as old as 3 years old assimilate these negative racial stereotypes that are everywhere. And so there's a very famous experiment done by Phyllis Devane. And she sits out in a park in a multiracial area of a city, and she just wants to see how little kids interact with each other around issues of race. And so one of her little kind of research nuggets says, I was watching this little 3-year-old white girl with her mommy, come walking up to the baby carriage that's being pushed by an African American mom. And the little white girl looks in and says, "Look, Mom, a baby made." That kid's lost. That kid is destroyed. Do you understand that that kid's cognitive functioning has been hardwired to see the world and the people in it through this set of racial stereotypes? And all the literature affirms that basically by 5 years old, it's too late to do anything. Your kids are already polluted with these languages of racism. Ask your kids about the N-word. They'll never have heard it in your house, I hope, but ask them if they know it. Ask them about what a wetback is. Ask them about baby shakers. You'd be amazed at what your kids can tell you about the languages of racism that they've learned. And so we all learn the language of Indian savagery in America. In fact, the first great popular novels, the first great nonfiction seller after the Bible, Blackstone's commentary, was The Captivity Narratives of Mary Jameson. White people got into all this sort of psychosexual imagery of Indians swooping down and stealing young innocent women, like Daniel Day-Lewis and Russell Means. I don't know about Russell, The Last of the Mohicans. Go into Walgreens and go to the trashy novel section. And there's all these like Indian sex fantasies, right? It's like white damsels. And then there's like Indian women who kidnap white men. I don't go there a lot, but it's just research. No, it's just research. Coming, honey. Burning people at the stake. I always do this to my students. Close your eyes, because you all know what a real Indian looks like. So close your eyes. Everybody close your eyes. Does she look like this? Ask your kids if they know who this is. Of course they know who it is. Or do they look like this guy? Up on the Crow Reservation, I had some Indian woman back say, "Where's he at? Where's he at around? I ain't seen him. Is he from this res? Our men all got them bellies and they're out of shape." And then some Indian guy says, you don't look that great yourself, And then I'm in this gender war. Oh, man. So I don't show this on the res anymore. Peter Pan and the Indians. How many of us sort of, again, ask your kid to speak Indian. What 2 words will your kid say? Ugh and how. Because we all know that's how Indians talk, right? The stoic Indian sitting there. This is where you absorb this language of racism before you know anything about affirmative action and diversity training and cultural awareness days and, kumbaya on the mall and all that stuff. By the time we get here in college, forget it. You're all doomed. And that's my point. The whole legal system, the judges, the lawyers, the prosecutors, all speak this language, and my God, it's the only language they know. I asked my students to name a real, this is my Kreskin the magician, the mind, I'm going to read minds. Okay. All right, you ever see Johnny Carson, the Karnak? This is Karnak the Magnificent. Okay. Close your eyes, can you name a real Indian chief? Have you got him in your head? Is it this guy? Or is it this guy? How many, can I read minds? How many people's mind did I read? Because that's who they know. I asked my students, name an Indian chief that didn't kill white people in the 19th century. Can you name one? Can you tell me who this is? How many people know who that is? She's a real Indian chief. That's Wilma Mankiller, won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, first woman chief of the Cherokee Nation, who was smart enough to stay away from the slavery issue, for goodness sake. So I asked my students if they speak the language of Indian savagery, because they all do. How many people know who this guy is? Don't say. How many people know? Raise your hand high. All right, now this is like Jacques Leotard in the Postmodern Dilemma. How many people know who this guy is now? So, talk about kind of an identity crisis. Nobody knows who you are until you stand next to a white guy in a black mask. Oh, now I know, it's Tonto. And the dude's name is Lone Ranger. And how many people knew the horse? Hi-ho! The horse gets more play than the Indian guy. Do you understand how bad it is? Do you understand what you're up against? How many here are Indian educators? You were, you see? Forget it now. Nobody wants to do it. It's impossible. This is the garbage that you're dealing with. My women students always get mad about sports questions, but I ask my women students, how many people know who this is, what this is? You know that? And most of my non-Indian women students know who that is, but none of them could tell me who Wilma Mankiller is. True or false, the person wearing this uniform is going to go fight in Iraq or play the national pastime? Who knows what they do down at that stupid stadium? Okay, what's this called? The tomahawk chop. And then I asked, name another Indian ceremony. Name another ritual gesture. And then one of them, I almost hit him in the face, said, Hal? No, wrong answer. True or false, this guy is praying for rain or celebrating a 3-point field goal. That's Chief Alenawek, and he rose from the dead last week. How many people saw the chief rose from the dead? You can't kill them once they're down. We thought we'd killed them. But then the president relaxed his rule at Illinois and allowed him to appear at some sort of homecoming function. I was out there a couple months ago, and there are people jumping off 7-story buildings because this guy ain't around anymore. It's the end of Western civilization as we know it. Seriously. a lot depends on context, you know. So how many people know who this is? Chief Wahoo, right? So you're working for a PR firm, and you've just bought a new baseball franchise, and you know your job is to come up with a new marketing insignia, and you really like this, but it's already taken, so you come up with a brand new one, and it's this one. What do you think, boss? You're fired. Get out of here. Are you crazy? You can't do that. Well, if we can't do that, how come we can do that? Because that's Chief Wahoo. Everybody knows Chief Wahoo. You become habituated to the outrageousness and the scandalousness of this language of racism that everybody speaks, and it's continually reinforced because you don't know any live Indian chiefs. You can't name any positive Indian role models. Everything you know and see about Indians is this garbage. And some of the stuff has real life impacts. And so the University of North Dakota is still fighting this nonsense over the Fighting Sioux logo. And you can see in the 60s and 70s that this was kind of where they were at with this. You know, kind of cute and funny, and the little squaw there, and they got some criticism. So they said, okay, we're going to get a new marketing company, and we're going Gestalt, okay? So it's like, ooh, 80s and 90s, you know, it's like the kind of disco guy in the shadow, right? And nobody knows, and nobody's buying anything because you can't, you know, sell a lot of stuff with, you know, kind of black, white insignias. So they changed that and got this guy, Indian Dude Man, okay? I mean, now I know what women feel like when guys pull out the Playboy. I feel inadequate. I mean, I can't live up to it. I mean, this is pornography of the word. I mean, come on. My wife sees this, and I just don't get there. You know what I'm saying? So Indian Dude Guy is everywhere on campus. He's in the bricks. He's on the floor. I'm not kidding. One rich alumni kind of donated an ice hockey stadium and cemented this image in the floor and said, if you ever take it out, you're going to lose billions of dollars, and it'll be the end of Western civilization. And so this honors Indians. Except if you walk around that building and look at some of the T-shirts people are wearing. So Buck the Bison. And so you have an Indian here committing sodomy, the Fighting Sioux, on this buffalo. Or I like this. They do this sucking sound at the game because they call them the Sucking Sioux. So you got all these white people going, and it's so North Dakota. I mean, it's not rowdy at all. It's a bunch of 10,000 white people sucking, and the hockey guys are trying to hear, and that's what they wear. And then my favorite, below us, you have an Indian committing fellatio on a buffalo bison. That's one of their interconference rivals. And it says, we saw, they sucked, we came. So it must be really nice to send my daughter to the University of North Dakota, okay? What a wonderful atmosphere it must be there. But you know, these are just T-shirts. This is what your typical college frat boy wears, and he's a little bit drunk, and you know, it's just kind of good fun, and Indians shouldn't be so sensitive until they come to the UND Indian Studies Department one morning and see this posted on the door. If you get rid of the Fighting Sioux, then we get rid of your free schooling, drink them lots of firewater, pay taxes, find something better for time like a job, live at the res for free, you lost the war, sorry. A+ for economy of expression on racial stereotypes. That is brilliant. You know he's probably at the top of his class at UND to have that power of expression and emotion and be able to work that out. But these symbols honor Indians, so why do we get so upset? In fact, the research indicates that this stuff really does affect minorities, that these stereotypes get into our heads, that they are inscribed in everyday life, that they exist in the world, they are a reality that minority people have to deal with, that they're powerful in the performance of minorities, and recent research, in fact, finds non-minorities. So some of the tests would just ask black students to take a test and say, this is just a standard instrument, just take it for an hour. And the black students would score just as well as the white students. And then two different groups of black and white students were told, this is an intelligence test, same exact test. And the black students scored more poorly on the exam because you're aware of the stereotype. It's choking. If you're the Chicago Cubs, if you're the Boston Red Sox, and it's the 9th inning, and the stereotype is you're going to choke, guess what you're thinking about? You're going to choke. And so White Men Can't Jump, one of Claude Steele's students, went to Tulane and wanted to see if these stereotypes affected white people. So he designed an experiment. He would have 10 white kids come in, relatively athletic, and he'd have them do push-ups, pull-ups, and then jumping and touching a backboard. And so these 10 white kids came in, and the white guy in the lab coat with his chalkboard is writing it all down. Okay? And so he gets the measure. And then he has the kids rest up and drink some Gatorade, okay, and look at some Playboys, I don't know, whatever. Get that testosterone up. And then he brings the same group of white guys out. And this time, the only difference in the experiment is it's the black guy with the chalkboard. So guess what? And every time it's repeated, it comes out the same. The white guys do the same basic amount of push-ups and pull-ups, but they don't jump as high. Why? Because if in front of a black guy, everybody knows white men can't jump. So it's there. It's a reality. And everybody speaks these languages. Stephanie Freiberg here at the U of A, in fact, gave a series of images to Indian and white kids living on or near a reservation. And so the first group, she showed Pocahontas. The second group, white and Indian, she shows Chief Wahoo. Third group, she gives them a card and just gives them some information to read. Oh, by the way, Indians have a real high suicide rate, and did you know alcoholism rates are enormous too? Thank you very much. And then the fourth group didn't do any. They were the prime. They got no prime. They were the control group. And then she gives each of these groups of students a standard self-esteem test. It's a standard instrument that high school counselors use all over the country. And it gives you a pretty good idea of how the kid's feeling about themselves, whether they have high self-esteem or low self-esteem. And interestingly enough, for the white kids who are shown those primes, the control group has, in fact, about average self-esteem. That number's not out of the norm. Okay. I'm sorry, these are the Indians. So these are the Indian students. So that's basically the norm. The kids who are not shown those images score okay. And then look what happens. The kids who are shown the broken image, the broken Indian, have low self-esteem. The lowest self-esteem is the most offensive racial stereotype, Chief Wahoo. And then the Pocahontas image also lowers Indian self-esteem because I can't live up to that stereotype, or I reinforce that stereotype. But what's really interesting is what Freiberg found when she gave the same test to white kids. Their control was the same as Indians, but they were empowered by the stereotype. Their self-esteem goes up when they see these negative racial stereotypes. Why? I know, because the black guy said, white boy can't jump, right? That white boy can't jump. Everybody knows that. White boy can't dance, and you can't dance. Indians definitely can't dance. You live down to the stereotype. That's what this literature shows. And you live up to it too. Now you can play this both ways. In fact, Indians have learned. There's this group of Indian college kids at Colorado State who formed an intramural basketball team called the Fightin' Whites. And their mascot is the Chesterfield Man, you know? Because everybody knows that this is what white people look like. Nice suits, he's probably got a cell phone. And the motto is, everything's going to be all white. But this idea, and as I want to kind of go for about 7 more minutes. And a lot of my work kind of traces this idea of savage peoples as inferiors. And it really goes back to the Roman Empire and in classical antiquity. If you think about the Greeks, they were a colonial culture. And much of the world was surrounded by unknown and strange alien peoples. And what they tended to do was mythologize those strange and alien peoples as monsters. And I always like this, the Scythians are essentially what later become the Huns. And they ride horses. They're the great horse riders. But you see, for the Greeks who thought that anybody who didn't speak Greek was a barbarian, a savage, the idea that these Scythians who lived here on the Russian steppes could do anything was just impossible. And so when they heard reports of the savage Scythians to the north looking like they were on horses, if you could never conceptualize the idea of domesticating animals. Imagine you live in a world where nobody has learned the skill of domesticating animals. Then reports that human beings were riding horses was really proof that the Scythians had interbred with their beloved horses and formed monsters called the centaurs. And these savage, bestial people who violate natural law are always at war with humanity. So that in the very first book of the Iliad, this is it. This is the beginning of Western culture. Do you understand? The first book of the Iliad precedes the Bible. It's the first written work. And in book 1, the West encounters savages for the first time. Nestor's speech, I've never seen such men, nor shall I ever again. Shepherd of the people, Caeneus, Exadius, godlike Polyphemus, Theseus, son of Aegeus, like to the deathless gods. Strangest were they, strongest were they have met upon earth. They were strongest and they fought with the strongest, with the fiercest tribe of the mountain savages, the centaurs, and they entirely destroyed them. So from the beginnings of Western culture, the way that the West has proven itself is in defeating savage, uncivilized, barbarous, monstrous people. Celebrated the battle against the centaurs in this picture by de Cosmo in the 16th century. The Renaissance reimagines these ideas, these classical ideas of the savages. The Romans, of course, conquered the entire barbarian world and celebrated their victories. You go throughout Rome and you cannot miss the various imperial monuments to victories over the barbarian Gauls and savage Ostrogoths, and the Danes and the Brits. And you can always see the savages depicted as unshaven, without any clothes on, trampled by the superior Roman forces. And here the Romans, you know why they're checking the teeth. Slavery. And if his teeth aren't any good, well, you should have listened to your mom when she told you to brush them, because you die. And then you get these great triumphant battle arches and the Romans leading away barbarian peoples into slavery. The West was in Hadrian's column. You have the barbarians' heads on pikes celebrating the Emperor Hadrian's conquest of the Gauls. This is a culture that has celebrated the conquest of savages and barbarians for 2,000 years and created a legal architecture and a legal mythology of the dying Gaul. And think about the idea of the vanishing savage. The Romans had it in the idea that civilization would overcome these barbarians as well. Traceable through the Crusades and through the discovery of the New World, in which the Pope donated the entire New World to Christian Spain, because these lands were not in the actual possession of any Christian king or prince. And the English are chartered all of North America. So the king tells them they can propagate Christian religion to such peoples, yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. And by that mandate, Great Britain establishes its colonial empire, and the United States in the Revolutionary War wins that empire. And immediately after the Revolution, George Washington is asked by Congress, what should our Indian policy be? And Washington responds by using the same language of savagery that the West has articulated for 2,000 years. This was a practiced and measured response which every policymaker understood, because they understood that Indians were essential savages, paradigm savages. And so should we spend all this money and chase the Indians out of their homelands to Canada? And Washington, that's because that's what most of the congressional delegates were arguing. And Washington had just fought the Revolutionary War and was broke and says, you don't understand, you don't want to do that. I repeat it again, that policy and economy point very strongly to the expediency of being upon good terms with the Indians. Remember we talked about the Indian treaty tradition and how a treaty was a relationship of trust and protection? When white people signed treaties with Indians, they were measures of expediency, because the propriety of purchasing their lands in preference to attempting to drive them by force, which as we have seen is like driving the wild beast to the forest, which will return as soon as the pursuit is at an end. They're savages. They're like wolves. If you understand their nature, you'll understand how to articulate the appropriate policy and laws toward them. because Washington had absorbed this language of savagery and these stereotypes of backwards inferior peoples as part of that 2,000-year tradition of Western conquest and colonization. And they'll return as soon as the pursuit is at an end and fall on those that are left there, when the gradual extension of our settlements will surely cause the savage as the wolf to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. These people are just going to disappear. Civilization is going to come and wipe them out. Promise them their lands for as long as the water flows and the grass grows, because they are a doomed people. Every time civilization comes into contact with the savage, he disappears. The savage as the wolf. And so in 1823, in a case which still represents the foundational premises of modern federal Indian law, Chief Justice Marshall uses the same language of savagery to explain how Europeans could come to the New World on the discovery of this continent and appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants. The fact that these Indians were inferior human beings afforded an apology for considering them as the people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. Why could Europeans claim these superior rights to the lands of the New World? Because these people, these Indians, were subhuman. They had no rights that we had to listen to. And so the basic principle is that discovery gives title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. And then Marshall himself draws upon this 1,000-year-old language of savagery to explain the justifications for applying this harsh doctrine to Indians, which deny them their property rights. The tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war. How was work today, Daddy? Oh, it was war, okay? It's tough being an Indian. Every day is war, right? That's how I feel here at the U of A. I got to go out in the forest and hunt for my meal. And what would happen if you left it to the Indians? It was to leave the country a wilderness. And you couldn't conquer them and really govern them because they were as brave and as high-spirited as they were fierce. And here's my favorite part. Frequent and bloody wars in which the whites were not always the aggressors. Huh? Wait a second. You come over here, you invade our land, we defend ourselves, and we're not the aggressors. Wow. Sounds like Ward Churchill, but in reverse. Okay? Unavoidably ensued. European policy, numbers, and skill prevailed. You guys lost. Too bad. And so under that doctrine, we could see the steady erosion of Indian land rights. In fact, Washington was right. What did he say about the savage as the wolf? As civilization moves forward, the savage disappears until these tiny little reservations. The doctrines affirmed in 1955. Remember my Indian chief holding up the beads? Well, this was whether or not the Alaska Natives had a right to compensation for all of Alaska. And the Supreme Court said no, because every American schoolboy knows that the savage tribes of this continent were deprived of their ancestral ranges by force. And even when the Indians ceded millions of acres by treaty in return for blankets, food, and trinkets, it was not a sale, but the conqueror's will that deprived them of their land. And subsequent Supreme Court justices, including Justice Rehnquist, continue to use the same language of savagery to explain Indian rights. Now, some of you may know that on September 13th, the United Nations General Assembly, after 2 decades, finally passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 131-4 with 11 abstentions. The 4 countries that voted against it were all the English-speaking common law countries which follow the doctrine of discovery, amazing enough. England, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Because so long as they continue to use this idea as the savage as the wolf, as animating their Indian law and policy, they can never bring their law on indigenous people's rights into fundamental conformity with international law. So I'll stop there and ask a couple questions if anyone has them. So thank you. Okay.